thank you. I want to say thank you to the Waukesha Public Library and everyone involved in organizing Waukesha Reads, and to Ellen Lem, who is not here today, but who is the one who invited us to participate in this panel. And actually finding out that this is the 16th year, I believe I participated in the very first one.
Fahrenheit 451.
Okay, it was the second one then. It was when we read the Marge Piercy book. Yeah?
Must have been another big read program we didn't do Marge Piercy.
The Sex Wars book?
Nope,
About
not
the
us.
Comstock Law?
Not us.
I went to the Civic Theater and I talked on stage.
You sure it wasn't Farewell to Arms?
Maybe I hallucinated the whole thing. Okay, clearly I hallucinated the whole thing, my memory. Oh, now I'm just confused. But anyway, I have participated in a few different Waukesha Reads programs over the years, and I have greatly enjoyed it. And I'm here today to talk to you about Cold Millions as a Western novel, as a novel of the West. So I was trained as a historian of the American West at UW-Madison, which is one of the top universities for such things, which I will explain to you in a couple of moments. And my research focuses on early to mid-century California. So this connects to a number of topics that I find fascinating and cover in my own work. My first book from was on an event in 1915, so this setting in 1909 is very similar to that. There are a lot of themes that have occurred in my own work. So what I want to talk about today a little bit is the vision of the American West that is conveyed through this book. And when I tell people that I study Western history, particularly in Wisconsin, they think that means I study the Old West. And in fact, PowerPoint thought that too. Because I left this because this is the slide that PowerPoint suggested to me when I hit design options, and it saw Western history, and so this is what it gave me. And it's a beautiful cover, so I decided to go with it. But often that Old West is the mythic time when cowboys fought Indians and heroic individuals triumphed over the wilderness. Now, if you know me or my work at all, you know that this is not at all what I study. And in fact, I often position my own scholarship to undermine that myth of the Old West. And what I would argue is that so too does Jess Walter in his book. His book is also very much positioned as a counter to the mythic West that continues, I think, to dominate in American culture in a lot of ways. And so I want to spend a few minutes today talking a little bit about first the myth of the West, and then offer a few thoughts on ways in which the book adheres much more closely to historical reality than it does to the mythic West. Now, I could go on for hours about this, and I won't, so I'm just going to offer a few examples. But first, this is a scene from a very famous Western film. Probably could be many different Western films. Any guesses?
Stagecoach.
Yes! A winner in the
Says
bag.
on the bottom.
All right, well, yeah, fine. You're better than my students, though. Often they don't read the things on the slide. Yes, this is Stagecoach, shot in Monument Valley, a very famous setting for Western films. And this is an advertisement for Buffalo Bill's Wild West show from the late 19th and early 20th century. These two images, the Stagecoach still and the Buffalo Bills ad, reflect a lot of popular culture's vision of the West. They include huge expanses of uninhabited land across which brave white Americans travel to a better life. Lone gunmen often figure here, as well as, quote, savage or defeated native peoples, brave sheriffs who uphold order in the face of outlaw attacks, prostitutes with hearts of gold, and delicate white women who need protection from the elements. Other visions of the West include the brave pioneers, particularly the pioneer mother, who often brings civilization and morality to the unruly frontier. They also reflect an undercurrent of American exceptionalism upon which the myth of the West is built. These popular visions of the are built on the academic interpretation of the American West laid out by this man, Frederick Jackson Turner, in his very famous 1893 address, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. Some of you may be familiar with Turner. He was professor of history at UW-Madison at the time, and he went on to become really the father of Western history as a topic of study. According to Turner, as you can see in this excerpt, this is a full quotation from his address. So these are not my words, these are his words. According to him, American democracy, these are my words, those are his. American democracy and culture was born in the West, in the struggle between what he calls savagery and civilization that occurred on the frontier. As each generation moved west, he argued, American institutions were reformed and democracy was strengthened as communities, quote, civilized the frontier and spread American values across the continent. And that is expressed here. Native peoples were an obstacle in his vision to be pushed aside in the inevitable American march westward. When he spoke in Chicago in 1893, he famously declared that the frontier was now closed, and that's part of what you see here, and no longer a factor in American development because as of the 1890 census, there was no longer a clear demarcation or a frontier line between settled and unsettled areas. And so the frontier was supposedly closed. And that was what he used as kind of the hook for his address. The end of the Plains Indian Wars, marked by the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre, supports his claim and for many people that this is sort of the end of the Old West. Now, I could spend the rest of my time here debunking Turner, but I'm going to resist that impulse, since many scholars have very effectively and eloquently done just that. But instead, I want to highlight two key factors. First, his claim that the movement west was essential to developing American character and national identity. And second, that his academic interpretation is the bedrock upon which the popular myth of the West is built. However, as Jess Walter's book, I think, reveals very clearly, life in the early 20th century American West was not as clearly defined, as clear-cut as pop culture or Frederick Jackson Turner would have us believe. So I want to comment now on just a few elements of the Cold Millions that I think can help us envision a more historically realistic version of the American West. First, any Western history written in 2022 begins with the acknowledgement that the development of the American West, the development of the United States, is a history of settler colonialism and the dispossession of native peoples from the land, from their original ownership of the land that they had inhabited for thousands of years. I meant to look for Carol's land acknowledgement, but I forgot. So Jules and his daughter, Gemma, are the only two native voices, I believe, in the book that we hear at all. And Jules is solely in the beginning of the book, Gemma reoccurs at the end, which I liked quite a bit. And the painful outlines of their family story parallel reality. That the two of them denied their relationship to each other as well as to everyone else so that Gemma could pass as Italian rather than Indian to avoid being sent to a government boarding school was not an unlikely invention on the author's part. A young Indian girl growing up in the late 19th century would, according to federal policy, have been required to attend a federal Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school. There she would have been taught English, Christianity, and white middle-class American values and practices. Native languages were banned, native religious practices were forbidden, and children suffered corporal punishment for any kind of misbehavior. This is an image, this is from St. Mary's Mission in South Dakota. I think it's about 1900, so it's about the same time, probably a little after Gemma might have been in school. But you can see these are children with their hair shorn, dressed in typical American Western clothing. They are being taught the curriculum designed to fully assimilate Native peoples into white middle-class American values, and to destroy, not just assimilate, but actively destroy Native culture and Native values. And Jules personifies that in a lot of ways in the book, right? He's a drifter, he has no home, no family, and not even a clear identity, since his own daughter doesn't know his true name, right? When he's buried and her husband asks, well, would he want to be buried in put up in a tree? And, and she's like, well, he doesn't, we don't have his name. Like, she didn't know what his name was. And I think, so his story very much parallels the story of many Native peoples in the late 19th century, because this is what happened. I'm not entirely certain. There are multiple, the audiobook pronounced it Salish. I don't know if it's, I always thought it was Salish, but I'm guessing that Salish might be more accurate. I'm not certain which people Jules would have belonged to, because there are coastal Salish people and there are inland Salish people. But this is a map that shows the treaty sessions. So the land that was turned over, the regions that were turned over to Washington State, Governor Isaac Stevens in the mid-19th century, about 1854 to 1856. There's a huge number of treaties that were signed between Stevens and other federal representatives, and representatives of all of these different tribes. And you can see here that there's a huge variety of people, some of whom are related to each other, have similar languages, others do not. The result, of course, is the massive dispossession of land and the confining of tribal people, Native peoples to reservations. And this is a map of current reservations today in Washington State. So it gives you a little bit of a sense of, obviously the huge distinct difference between, this, I don't know, how do I go backwards here? This land and this land. So my cursory research suggests that the Flathead Reservation, which I think is probably the closest, I believe that's actually in Montana. Yeah, it's Montana. Might be closest to where Jules's people might have been, but I'm not entirely certain. However, this slide also reminds us of something that the myth of the West does not account for, and I would actually argue the book also does not account for, and I have a little bit of an issue with, which is the persistence of Native culture. So, despite the fact that there was massive land dispossession and attempts at assimilation, right, and enforced assimilation by the federal government on Native peoples, Native peoples continued to live, to flourish sometimes, to try to protect their religions, their languages, their traditions. We have today, obviously, there's a strong attempt at language revitalization, which if you read the afterword in the book, Walter talks about how he actually worked with a school in Spokane, and I looked at their website today, that's actively trying to preserve and revitalize Native language. And part of the myth of the West is the replacement, right? Is the idea that Native peoples kind of vanish, literally the vanishing Indian. But the truth is that nothing's that simple, and that Native peoples continue to live and inhabit the West across the 20th century into the 21st century. And I think that is one issue I have with, I don't know that Walter should have done something different, but I think his image, the image that he depicts of Native peoples is very pessimistic, and there's no representation of the persistence of Native culture necessarily. And I don't know that he did that deliberately, but I think in that space, his book buys in a little bit to a certain element of the myth of the West. He doesn't glorify or romanticize in the same way that many myths of the West do. but I do think that his depiction doesn't quite account for the full picture of Native engagement in the West. So I could talk more about that, but I won't. So the myth of the West often has little room for real people, as I've suggested, and particularly not for real women. Women in Western imagery, as I mentioned, are often prostitutes or virtuous mothers who bring civilization to the West. And they are very nicely encapsulated by these pioneer mothers. A good friend of mine, who's a historian in North Dakota, has written a whole book about pioneer mothers and pioneer mother monuments. And she has an amazing website that has all of the pioneer mother monuments across the country documented. And her name is Cindy Prescott, and I got these from her website. And because they echo, these are from the 1920s, and they were an attempt at memorializing the West, right, and claiming a room for women in the West, but it's motherhood, it's women as bringing civilization, as being maternal, and that's the acceptable role for women. And we can see that in the book with all of the harassment, maybe is the best way to put it, right, that Gurley Flynn gets for not acting in a way. But the truth is, many women didn't act in that way, and there are many, many women in the West who were neither prostitutes nor mothers, actually. And I wanted to tell you a brief story about single women homesteaders in the West. So the Homestead Act was passed in 1862 and allowed for American citizens, or those who could become eligible for citizenship and had declared their intent to become citizens, to lay claim to 160 acres in the West. Later the amount changes. For very cheap, they just had to inhabit and improve the land. And not only did many women participate in this as members of families, obviously, because men and women brought their families, but the only requirement for a homesteader was that they had to be head of household. So women who were single or divorced or widowed were actually eligible to file for homesteads on their own. And I found one estimate that said more than 100,000 women got homesteads in their own name. And another estimate that said about 12% of homesteaders in Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Utah were single women. So it's not an enormous amount, but it's also not insignificant. Yeah, there's a lot of single women who are out there. These are These are actual single women homesteaders. This is from the National Parks, has a Homestead National Monument, I believe, and they have a whole web page about single women homesteaders. And I came across an argument from a historian, actually, who argues that some of you may know this, the first states to grant women suffrage were in the West. So Wyoming is the first state to enfranchise women, and this author makes the argument that women homesteaders were actually integral to the passage of the 19th Amendment, which is, right, the amendment that enfranchised women. And that the large number of women who went out and became landowners, those women then voted, and those women voted to enfranchise all the women who didn't yet have the vote. So there are many women across the West who claim homesteads, and there are many women from lots of different ethnic backgrounds. I was recently at a conference where I went to a fascinating panel about Syrian homesteaders in North Dakota. And I learned that the woman who was doing this research had found a record of an exception that other scholars had said did not exist, which was a single Muslim female homesteader in North Dakota in the first part of the 20th century. So she definitely does not belong in the myth of the West. I don't know how we fit that woman into the myth of the West. So the third piece, and my time is going longer, that I want to turn to, obviously, female homesteaders is one element, but the other part I wanted to briefly speak on is the diversity of people in the West. I mean, one of the reasons I'm from California, so I'm a Westerner, but I also find the Western history fascinating because there's so many different groups of people that are interacting in the West. And the racial dynamics that historians describe for American history that are true maybe in the South or the Midwest really aren't true in the West, right? There are very different combinations of people, very different racial dynamics that are going on. And a lot of historians are starting to realize that now, and I think the public is a little bit more too. But Walter, I think, does a great job of depicting immigration, right? He talks, it's very clear how many of the workers, how many of the Wobblies are immigrants, and especially Italian immigrants, and the extent to which their immigrant identity exposed them to prejudice, right? The judge who was elongating the name of I can't remember his name now, but the Italian right there, to really emphasize that he was, and imply that he's not really American. It's possible to argue that the strain of anti-immigrant sentiment that became prevalent in the 20th century really originates in the West, and it originates in anti-Chinese sentiment, specifically first in California, but then across the West. This is a depiction of one of the most famous anti-Chinese riots, massacres really, at Rock Springs, Wyoming in 1885. But there were dozens, hundreds of episodes in which white mobs ran Chinese out of town, burned their houses, burned their communities, burned Chinatowns in the 1880s, leading up to, well, actually this is immediately after the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is in 1882. And then it got strengthened a few years later in response to all of this violence. So the first attempt by the federal government's first action to exclude a group of people from the United States, Chinese immigrants, was taken because of the West. That motivation came completely out of Western mining camps and communities after a couple decades of Chinese immigration. It was based completely on race. 30 years later, 20 years later, the same thing occurs in San Francisco, as there is a crisis around segregation of Japanese school children that results in the Gentleman's Agreement and the exclusion of Japanese laborers from immigration to the United States, which then all of this leads eventually to the 1924 immigration law that dramatically restricts who can come to the United States and completely restricts Asians, allows no Asian immigration, and also leads directly to internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. So all of this is to say that the West is a very complex place that is not easily reduced to a myth. Surprise. And I think Walter's book offers a lot of entrees into discussing that. I'll be happy to take your questions later. I'm happy to talk about any of this later, but I will turn this over to Lily at the moment. Down there.
Yes. Yes. Super. Hello, everybody. And thank you again, as Abby said, to Waukesha Reads and the Waukesha Public Library and our good friend Ellen Lem for including me once again. I have been on these panels before, and a lot of my research, as you heard in the introduction, has to do with sort of understanding what popular culture sort of teaches us about who we are and how we understand ourselves. And so this is a little bit of my space in terms of thinking about broader American myths. Abby did a wonderful job talking about the myth of the West, and I want to talk a little bit more about also myths, but the sort of myths that are embedded within sort of narrative understanding of who we are as Americans, which I think that the Cold Millions sort of, again, takes up but also troubles in terms of how people are presented as heroes and anti-heroes, and certainly with regard to sort of class struggles. And so I want to, as I always do, talk about the value of cultural artifacts and the value of popular culture. Shakespeare, at the time that he wrote his plays, was a popular culture writer. And so if you lived in Elizabethan England in the 1600s and you were going to plays, you were going to sort of the time of popular culture, Shakespeare and Marlowe. Now we look at them as, of course, high culture, right, and literature. But the understanding of like the value of popular culture is something that, again, as I said, sort of does provide an avenue in to think about who we are as individuals, as citizens, what the country is about, which is a little bit of what I'm going to talk about as well. And we have in the United States, because we have this short history compared to our European brethren and our Latin American brethren and sisters and our Asian brethren and sisters, but we have this sort of understanding of, you know, who has described us. Mark Twain and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Edgar Allan Poe and Herman Melville, and they all happen to be white dudes. And occasionally we throw somebody in like maybe Toni Morrison or Ralph Ellison, who may be of color or slightly different genders. But we have these embedded sort of understandings of the sort of popular culture that helps us think about the United States and often guides us, and we read it in high school or college. And so I have often thought about those narratives and trying to understand the politics of the United States as well as trying to think about and understand the literature itself, or sort of more broadly understood, the cultural artifacts, which brings in film and television and other ways that we have these images conveyed to us. As Abby said, when she went to find an image on PowerPoint, it produced something that was an image that you would expect. And so in a lot of times we have these imagined spaces and we put into them what we kind of expect. And so this is a cowboy, of course, right? But he's distinct because our usual vision of a cowboy doesn't usually entail somebody who is black. And yet black cowboys are sort of a big part of our understanding of who cowboys were. And that's also where we are sort of going with regard to our understanding of the West as well. So I wanted to move through a couple of the ideas that often frame our thinking about sort of the American idea and the narrative that is the United States. And of course, we end up in a lot of places and in a lot of ways talking about heroes and individualism. And certainly the Cold Million brings us some of that as well. But one of the points that Alexis Tocqueville, our friend who visited us in the 1830s and wrote an extremely long book called Democracy in America. It's that big. There are 2 volumes of it. And I don't make my students read it with any regularity. But Tocqueville came here and sort of looked around as an interesting early sociologist and thought about sort of what he saw in this burgeoning democracy. And one of the points that he makes that I put up on this slide is the sort of loneliness of the American individual and the solitude. And the whole time I was reading The Cold Millions, this was something that was striking me that so many of the characters were experiencing, be they wealthy or poor, right? That there was this kind of individual estrangement from each other. That is so dominant in that narrative and so many other narratives as well that sort of talk about the United States. And so I wanted to sort of think about that in context of, again, this is Huck Finn and Jim, again, a sort of primary novel of the United States. That's a little bit earlier in setting than The Cold Millions, but certainly sort of starts to take up some of these same tensions around class and certainly around race. And I also wanted to think about it in context of the fact that War and Peace figures quite dramatically into the book, right? which is not exactly what you expect in a novel that's about the West. But I think that Walter is making a point with regard to how Ray basically feels this kind of acute loneliness and separation because he doesn't have a lot of family and he doesn't have a lot of money, so that there is nothing that he can feel comfortable around, and he finds that, strangely enough, War and Peace and sort of Russian tragedies are somehow speaking to his soul. And he spends a lot of time talking about that as well. But he also talks about what a novel does for him, which is it takes him someplace else, right? It lets him imagine himself someplace else. And that's often what we're also thinking about when we think about cultural artifacts, is how do they translate into our imagination a different concept and a different place and a different being. And I did enjoy the way that the monologues that Walter provides for us sort of give us this opening into how and why the people were thinking what they were thinking. It wasn't a straight narrator just telling us sort of what was going on, but we have the internal monologue at so many different places about so many different things. So if we think about the Cold Millions in context, and my esteemed colleague has given us a lot of context to think about this, I wanted to sort of talk about it sort of in part about the West, but also in part about sort of the way that the United States often thinks about itself, right? The imagined self, ourselves, the individual, the citizen, the country, the actual sort of state of the continent that this landmass provides as where, you know, white settlers and colonialists came and took as a possession. And of course, this idea of the American dream, which is something that is batted around all the time, but it also gives us some concept of what we think is possible in the United States. And so I wanted to think about this in the literary and cultural ideas, right? Particularly with regard to selves. And so we have these myths, these embedded myths of the rugged individuals. And we see that with regard to our initial sort of confrontation with Gig, that he kind of fits into that because he initially, when we meet him, he is a stronger person, and he's very determined, and he's doing what he thinks he needs to do in order to sort of make the world a better place and make his life better. We see this idea of bootstrapping, right? Of bringing yourself up by your bootstraps in the women, I think. In both Elizabeth and Ursula, who have to figure out, you know, how to make their way, both Ursulas. And then, of course, we have Lem with his created success. He's the one who shows us the sort of the success story. And he says he did it all by himself, of course. Everybody always does. And this also translates to the country as a whole, right? That the country of the United States is rugged. And I have these images from South Dakota where we have chosen to drill into mountains to make faces on them, which is the strangest thing. And I've been there, it's fascinating, but it's also a weird thing to do as a group. This is like, okay, this is who we are, faces on mountains. And that at the same time we hear about where the work is in the Cold Millions. It's the work is provided by the fact that there is resource, right? There's silver mining, and there's cropping, and there's all kinds of different other kinds of minings, and there are rushes. And so that there's all of this resource that is in the land, the land that is taken from other people, at the same time that this is a kind of birthright that most Americans sort of say, we have this is our land, right? And then there is, connected to that, this idea of sort of conquering it, right? And this is again, the West is closed, it's all been settled, as Dr. Marquand pointed out with regard to some versions of history. But we also have this long discussion about how much Dell hates Spokane, right? Why does he hate it so much? Because it's full of adversity and corruption and terrible people, and it never makes him happy, and he dies there. Sorry, spoiler. But it's again sort of this interesting perspective, because you hear him very critical of this place that not everybody else is really loving, but they're not that sort of bad on it. And all of this connects to, because this is this narrative about class and workers' freedom and the exploitation by those who have the means of production, this idea of the sort of the American dream. And what we see at every turn in so much of this conversation in the Cold Millions is that the American dream is being stomped on in lots of ways by, the turn of the century robber barons. And that's what we hear and see all about, the sort of distinction between the rich and the poor. Lots and lots of different ways that Walter is talking about that. I have a little thing on the screen that says it wants a new version of something. And it doesn't want to let me, okay, it's gone now. Sorry about that. A little distracting. And so I want you to think about, in having read this book, the way that Walter does in fact talk about the class differences, not just by sort of talking about how distinct it is to be poor, really, hard-scrabble poor, but the way that Rye has these experiences where he is in the situation where he experiences wealth. And so he sees it and it makes him cry, right? It actually makes him cry. That's what he says when he's at Lem's house. Because he doesn't understand how he can experience this and his brother can be in jail also. And so that goes to this sort of rags to riches story, the idea of success from nothing, but also the sort of displacement, that if you don't have this, he's also constantly displaced when he goes shopping, right? He's taken to the end of the block and told to leave the area. Okay, now it doesn't want to continue. There we go. So we have this, again, this idea of place and imagined space. This is one of my very favorite quotes from any author at any time, as you think about sort of the way that different countries and different people think of themselves. And Fitzgerald doesn't sort of give us an unencumbered idea about the United States, but he does distinguish it from these other older empires, right? That he talks about it as a quality of the idea. But at the same time, he says, it's about people dying at war to defend it. And so it's an interesting short story that he wrote about 2 weeks before the crash in 1929. And I would commend it. The Swimmers is a really beautiful story. But I think that it also sort of points out the sort of feeling of kind of displacement and exclusion and inclusion that we have throughout the Cold Millions. And that, again, this idea that the United States has been this land of creation, in part because there was apparently nothing here when people turned up from Europe. So we could just have this new continent and build all kinds of things. And as an individual, you can also, of course, recreate yourself, which is always happening in all of our cultural artifacts. We always have heroes who are actually taking different names, presenting themselves as having different backgrounds. And this happens in our books, in our narrative novels and short stories. This happens in television show after television show after television show. This happens in movies. And so we have this sort of idea of the creation story that maps onto the creation story of the United States itself. That this was someplace that anything could be created. And this is also where we find our heroes and anti-heroes in the cold millions. But I also wanted to talk about the fact that the heroes and the creation stories, some of them are considered to be sort of positive, morally upright, sometimes. Other times there's a little bit of hesitancy, right? And sometimes the creation stories happen because of something that's criminal, something that's wrong, something that's bad that somebody has done in order to recreate themselves. And what we see in Rye is kind of the hero who isn't creating himself. But he is being buffeted by all of these other experiences that he has, and he often doesn't know how to respond, which I thought was also an interesting way of thinking about him compared to all the other characters that we see along the way. And to look at somebody like Jules, who has to recreate himself because essentially he was told to do so by his family so he would survive. And he has the capacity to do that because he's also bilingual, trilingual, at least. And he sort of understands what he needs to do in order to, in fact, respond to his situations, which is, again, how do you create yourself anew? But the other flip side of the creation story, both for the country and for the individual, is that this is a country full of confidence men and diddlers, a term that was actually created by Edgar Allan Poe. And so I've listed a whole bunch of different people who sort of fall into that overarching umbrella, and you'll also notice, I think, they're all men. Once again. And so the confidence men and drifters and diddlers and grifters are endemic in American arts and letters. It is a constant trope that we see. And these are both images from the Melville book, The Confidence Man, which is about somebody who gets on a steamboat and constantly changes who he is as different passengers get on and off the boat. And it's a fascinating novel, certainly not about a whale, and it is in sort of this context. And for anybody who has watched a little bit of television in the last decade or two, say something like Mad Men or The Sopranos, you've seen the same sort of narrative as well. And we see this in Dell, we see it in Al Bolin, and we also obviously see it in early Reston, who's, I don't even know what his real name was, right? He had so many names, and again, he was a complete grifter and confidence man, and also an assassin. So that happens. But this is like the flip side of the hero of the creation story, is that these are also people who are presented as heroes and are creating and recreating themselves. So then I sort of move into my sort of political scientist hat a little bit, or political theorist hat. And I talk a little bit about this idea of the democratic tensions, the tensions that are sort of at the heart of the United States as a democracy. And this is also some of what Dr. Marquin was talking about as well. And that we see that we have a desire to be part of the elite, at the same time that we really want to be ourselves, our authentic selves, right? And this is oftentimes what we want from politicians. We want them to be authentic. But what is it that is authentic about an individual? That's the tricky part. And democracy in the United States in particular gives us a lot of room to move around in that realm. In terms of like, how do I identify what is my authentic self? And in a lot of ways, I think Rye's story is his authentic story. And it doesn't come out too badly, right? He does sort of make it in the American sort of success story, but he is tragic at the same time. He's completely tragic. And he's completely attached to a brother who he ends up having to care for, that also ruptures their relationship. one of the interesting parts I thought about as I was reading this is that the time that Rye and Gig spend together in the book is extremely short. It's really interesting that Gig is such an important part of Rye's life and our story, but they spent almost no time together on the page as we sort of read through. So ultimately, we're sort of talking about the capacity for creation and recreation. And again, this is one of the things that Tocqueville pointed out about the United States in this kind of weird way, that there is this kind of freedom because of our disconnection, that oftentimes we don't necessarily know who our ancestors were the way you might in a land of landed gentry. We don't necessarily know all of those points. And Tocqueville talks about the fact that this also allows for a certain kind of freedom, but it means that you're alone. And this gets back to the loneliness that I think is endemic in the book. And so I sort of outlined right at the end of this slide the fact that we have a number of presentations of Jules and Rye and Gig and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and Ursula, and how they all participate in this kind of recreation myth that is part and parcel of the American narrative, that you can in fact make yourself anew, either for good or for evil, but that this is something that you have more capacity to do in the United States than almost any other country. And with that, I will turn off the slideshow, if I can figure out how to do that.
There you go.
And sit back down.
Oh, I
Should I
will
close
go.
it?
Yeah, let's do that.
Here we go. All right.
So if anyone has questions now, bring this over.
Sure.
Does anyone have questions?
There, there.
Both of your talks seem to me to have a direct line to what's going on in politics and the culture today. Certainly the history of what happened to the Native Americans, the Chinese, the Japanese, leads us to the record amount of Asian attacks, anti-Semitism. We're finally getting the history of those terrible Native American schools. But you know, one of the biggest thing in the culture right now is all across the country, people are being elected to school boards because of this critical race theory, which only exists at the university level. But based on what you both said, maybe we need to put it in the schools, but I'm editorializing. So I guess I would be interested in hearing both of you talk about, because I think we're going to hear from Jess Walter here tomorrow night. I think he purposely wrote about this time period because it does resonate so much with what's happening today. But I wanted to hear both of your thoughts about the relevance to today.
Does this one work? Okay. I did read something in reading about the book. The book was published in 2020, right? So it's pretty interesting because it's a book that became incredibly more relevant, right? I mean, after the summer of 2020 in the last couple of years, right? I mean, his themes really resonated, I think, in ways that he certainly didn't anticipate. But I think that's actually a marker of how accurate in some ways his book is, right? I mean, because he really is he's delving into things that, I mean, scholars have been talking about this stuff for years. I mean, not hundreds of years. Obviously, the last 50 years or so, right? Social history, you know, one of the effects of the civil rights movement was, okay, let's talk about some people in history who weren't white men, is the rise of the histories of everybody else. And that's a little bit about what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I think that scholarly work is finally starting to make its way into popular culture, right? And the last couple of years have really brought that out, I think. And so I think his work is definitely a comment on that. I'm not sure exactly what else you want me to respond to. I think that, on the other hand, I think I'll go on my soapbox, which is to say that I think that generally the teaching of American history in schools has declined dramatically and terribly. It has declined a lot over the past probably, I don't know what the decades would be, but the last few decades, right? So the emphasis on standardized testing and STEM and all of those things means that there's less and less attention being paid to social studies across the board, and obviously that's more acute in various areas. But I think that means that more and more people, younger people in particular, have no real understanding of history and no real understanding of American history, any kind of American history, whether it's the myth or the reality, which I think is dangerous, because I think that's what allows, it allows lots of many, paves the way for authoritarianism, etc. I don't need to go down that route right now, but I think this is important stuff, right? I think his book does a great job of bringing to life a lot of really important tensions.
Paves the way for, I didn't understand.
I said authoritarianism, but I didn't want to go down. An uneducated populace is generally a bad idea.
Thank you.
I didn't want to go too far into a political rant.
And I would just sort of continue on that path in the sort of other side of the coin in terms of civic engagement and civic education, which is, where I find students who come into my classes in political science with, sort of vague understandings of, how the government actually works. And then when I, sort of say, okay, here's the Constitution, let's all read it together. And they're like, oh, there isn't that stuff that I thought was in the Constitution. And there's stuff in there that I didn't think was in the Constitution. And so, I think that, so we have this difficulty with regard to social studies, but we also have this difficulty with regard to civic education that sort of in both realms lead to sort of a populace that doesn't have the blocks to understand, what the real history is, if they don't understand, here's how the government works and what it has done in the past with regard to these policy areas as well.
I was actually including civics and government in social studies.
That's fine.
Because in my class today, which was a 200 level class, not a single student could tell me how to amend the Constitution. I was not happy. Clearly they're not in my class. I need to take it. There's a hand over here.
Maybe this is kind of beyond the scope of this discussion, but I noticed in the book the kind of what it means to be masculine or a man, that, the characters in the book pretty much conform to that, and they seem like they kind of come out of what we imagine is the West, like all the movies and things about tough men. But, in all of this, there's not, I kind of, where, do you have any idea, where do we get our images about what women are supposed to be like? Because when I read books, I don't see that so much. But this kind of tough guy image comes up in a lot of books, and, then the guy's really kind with his family, but he's, like really masculine and tough, and, we certainly see it in politics now.
Do you mean in the West or in general?
Just in general. That's why I said maybe it's beyond the scope of this. But it seems like there's no roadmap for women. It's like, where do our ideas from?
Oh my gosh. We both teach women's studies.
Yeah.
Oh,
So we could talk about this for hours.
Well, as far as literature, can you think of any books or popular, novels where you would see kind of those threads of that?
And even I would even start, because the Cold Millions is where we are, but I would even start with like how Elizabeth was presented in her pregnancy, that she presented herself as being stronger and tougher, right? But that was seen as unfeminine, and unmotherly. And so we do, and again, the book does sort of center the men again, and we do have a lot of discussion about, how thin Gig had gotten in jail and so forth, and that was anti-masculine, his presentation. But I think that the how you imagine people to be, particularly the sort of the traits of masculinity and femininity, and male and female, also, in the non-binary space as well, that we have Abby and I could talk about that for 1,000 years.
I mean, I think so much of it comes from imagery, right, and advertising, and in the 20th century in particular, right? So the rise of advertising in the teens and 20s, and the rise of these amazing ads that I'm going to teach next week that tell women that they have all these problems they didn't know they had that could be solved through Listerine and washing machines and all these things, right? And there's this real emphasis on domesticity and appearance too. I was going to say that the emphasis on female appearance is very much a 20th century thing, I think. I think the domesticity comes earlier. Yeah. But there's a lot of prescriptive literature that's published in the 19th century that like got housewife guides for housewives, and then the Ladies' Home Journal starts publishing, and there's just all kinds of things that women read about what they're supposed to be like. And obviously there's the ultimate guide for most people in the United States in the 19th century, which is the Bible, right? I mean, and the Bible is the source of patriarchy and the patriarchal norms that are inherent to American culture at its base, right? Not that everybody adheres to them or anything, but if you look at the history of the United States, right, the foundation is very Christian, right? And those norms come directly from Christianity and that hierarchy, and that's where women's roles are laid out, and men's roles are laid out really clearly.
I just want to add something. Yeah, sorry. That's absolutely correct in all of that, obviously. But I would also add, in the United States in particular, is this idea that comes from the time of the founding of what is known as Republican motherhood. And that is also the devotion that the woman has to essentially being the responsible party for training everybody in their household and in their community in virtue, and also providing the country with soldiers and men. And so that's this sort of, and it's an ancient concept, but it's so embedded in the United States, this notion of Republican motherhood, that we continue, it's everywhere, and we see it all over us, and that's part of what you're talking about a bit.
Yeah, and I would add to that it's kind of used at that point to reconcile the inherent contradictions between the Declaration and the Constitution, and then a world in which women can't vote, right? Because there are women in the early time of the founding who are like, hey, wait a minute, maybe we want some rights, and then it's, no, Republican mother, right? So there's a role for women within a republic.
It's in the House.
That is it's about education, and it's within the House. It's not being a political actor. It's educating their sons to be political actors.
And educating everybody to be virtuous.
And very virtuous, but not to be political actors themselves.
Yeah.
Wow, how did we get to the founding?
I'll always get to the founding.
And is that Republican motherhood, those ideas are essentially American, or are they kind of drawn from European ideas, or?
The idea of Republican motherhood actually is sort of ancient Roman, in part, because that was what the requirement was, and even ancient Greece, that was what Pericles asked of the women in his funeral oration, was for them to have more babies for Athens, so that they could have more people to fight the war. As they're burying their sons and fathers and brothers, go have more, so that we have enough. So that's the concept of Republican motherhood, your devotion to the state is as this kind of mother. And so we have it in ancient Greece and we have it in ancient Rome, but I don't know that it necessarily comes in a lot of ways from sort of Europe.
I teach about this, but I teach it on a much more superficial level than you're asking about probably in some ways. I mean, I think it's articulated because the United States is the first republic, right? I mean, it's the first, it's the first modern republic, right? It's the first nation to not be a monarchy in modern times. And so I think it's recreated in the 1780s and 1790s by folks who are like men who are being challenged by some women like Judith Sargent Murray, who are well-educated women and who potentially think maybe there should be a role, and identify this challenge between like, what is a citizen, who's a citizen, and what goes with being a citizen. And so, again, this isn't totally my area, that part of it, but I don't think there is necessarily a European model because it's monarchy still, and I don't think Locke says a lot. I mean,
no, and again, it's sort of, you have this tension. It's like, what is the role for the female citizen? And that's exactly right.
right.
And so because you had females in the United States who were educated,
Right.
There were questions about property ownership, but you did have some that had access to property ownership and inheritance. So you do have, you do have somebody who looks like the men, but is female. And so it is this tension about like, how do you allow or sort of cultivate that citizen who is not the same as the white male citizen. And the United States has had a lot of issues with regard to who gets to be a citizen, and we still have those issues. And one of the difficulties obviously has been around the question of gender, and obviously there are other questions around race and so forth, and immigrants, but you do have this sort of commitment on some level to sort of trying to integrate the usefulness of the woman into the republic. So
Sounds
Abby
like
and
you
I
need a whole nother session on
Abby and I can come back and do a presentation.
Thank you for the question.
That'd be great. Any other?
Okay, I said a quick comment, and maybe you can comment on it too. A few years ago, our Waukesha Reads book was My Antonia by Willa Cather. Oh, that was a woman, I thought. I mean, yeah, she fed her kids, and she did a lot of other things too, though.
Yeah.
I found Willa Cather to be quite the author.
Yeah, I think she's a real. I didn't end up participating that year, and I haven't read that book since I was like in a long time. I read it when I was probably a teenager or maybe in college. But Cather's a really interesting author, right? And there are, and she's a Western writer in a lot of ways, and I think she encapsulates a lot of those challenges that that women on the plains in particular, right, faced, that are far more complex than any myth would have us think.
Yeah. Anyway.
But I think it also goes to what Abby was talking about with regard to homesteading, that, what the life of a woman in the United States, particularly on a quote frontier, was not a simple undertaking, and it was not all fainting couches and, bustles and stuff like that.
Someone have a question over there, this one. Anyone else? No? Sorry if I grabbed the microphone. Well, thank you, Abby and Lily, so much for coming tonight for the fascinating presentation.